I'm Dr. Jeff Calvert, and it's my privilege to introduce today's webinar, which is titled Development of a JEM, or Job Exposure Matrix, for exposure to smoke particle mass among FDNY firefighters. So as a bit of background, I'm sure you know, when conducting studies that examine the association between a toxic exposure and a health effect, accurately measuring exposure is a key requirement. So the question there is, okay, how do you measure that exposure? In a perfect world, we would directly measure exposure on each subject included in the study. But as you can imagine, directly measuring exposure on each study subject would be expensive, time-consuming, and it's almost never done. So for example, imagine hanging an exposure pump or device on every firefighter at every time they fought a fire. So it would be an understatement to say that that would be a challenge to collect such data. So we all carry computers in our pockets, I mean by a cell phone, and perhaps in the future, those cell phones can be configured to collect exposure data. But until that time, we need to find other ways to collect accurate exposure data. So another common way of collecting exposure data is just to ask the study subjects about their exposures. So the problem there is that's subjective, that's based on people's ability to recall their exposures. So it's not always very reliable to ask people about their exposures. So given that, another alternative and commonly used method to collect exposure data is to develop a job exposure matrix, or a JEM. Many of those have been developed for many different types of exposure. And today we'll hear about the development of a JEM for smoke particle mass exposures experienced by firefighters. And today's webinar is going to be delivered by Dr. David Goldfarb, who's building an impressive and diverse research portfolio. He's an epidemiologist whose focus is on occupational lung disease and cancer, specifically among 9/11 responders. He has a broad range of other research interests, including occupational mortality, cancer biomarkers, autoimmune disease, and hearing loss. And in fact, he's the PI of an R21 grant focused on smoking cessation treatment. And that studies a randomized controlled trial exploring the effectiveness of an enhanced care treatment for tobacco use disorder among FDNY firefighters and EMS workers. And I hope in the future he'll develop or deliver a webinar to share his findings with us. So he currently works as an epidemiologist at FDNY and is also a research assistant professor at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And regarding his education, he received all of his secondary education in New York City. And it seems a requirement he's got 3 different degrees, all of which are from schools with New York in the name. So maybe that's a requirement for him to have gone to that school. But he's got an undergraduate degree from NYU. He's got an MPH from State University of New York, or SUNY Downstate. And his PhD is in environmental and occupational health, specializing in epidemiology. And that was received from the City University of New York's Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. So without further ado, I present Dr. David Goldfarb, who will share his findings on a JEM that is sure to enhance our understanding of the effects of routine firefighting exposures. So take it away, Dr. Goldfarb.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the kind introduction, Dr. Calvert. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Dr. Kabali and Kristen and Ann and the team at NIOSH for giving me the opportunity to speak at this month's webinar. It's really a privilege to be able to present our group's work. So much of our research at FDNY, it's utilized an extensively well-characterized World Trade Center exposure metric, and we examine the relationship between exposures at the disaster site and the various health conditions that we've looked at over the years. So we primarily use time of arrival at the disaster site and occasionally duration at the World Trade Center site as sort of proxies for exposure intensity. However, today I'm excited to sort of delve into our study of the World Trade Center cohort, but specifically delving into ongoing firefighting, routine firefighting exposures among those who remained employed post 9/11. So again, the title of the presentation is Development of a Job Exposure Matrix, or a JEM, for exposure to smoke particle mass among firefighters of the FDNY. I thought I'd give a little bit of background, which will maybe help contextualize the topic. Firefighting is obviously an inherently dangerous profession. You have exposure to combustion byproducts that are present in smoke, and they really pose significant health risks. There's a lot in the literature about this. These chemicals could be categorized based on their effects on health and their class of compounds. So you have carcinogens like benzene and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. There are respiratory irritants like formaldehyde that cause breathing issues. There are asphyxiants, systemic toxins, to sort of name a few. There are a number listed here. That's not even a comprehensive list. But to address these risks, tools like a job exposure matrix or a JEM are crucial, right? The JEM analyzes exposure data, and it helps to implement safety measures and health monitoring for the firefighters. In terms of routine firefighting exposures, the levels of exposure to hazardous substances in firefighting, they vary based on several different factors. These include geographic location, specific tasks performed at a fire, so during their firefighting operation, the frequency and the duration of exposure at the incident site, severity of incidents encountered, and the effectiveness and the use of personal protective equipment. So these variables influence the degree of risk firefighters face from exposure to combustion and other dangerous chemicals. So understanding and accurately assessing these exposure levels are critical for developing strategies that are going to safeguard the firefighters' health and well-being. Just a kind of a sidebar, but the advent of self-contained breathing apparatuses, or the SCBA masks, they were mandated in the 1980s by the National Fire Protection Association, the NFPA 1582, the guidances. With that said, there is the possibility for occasional misuse or malfunction of PPE, including the SCBA, which remain concerning, right? So compliance with PPE protocols, it could vary based on several factors, as the severity of incidents and the stage of fire. So for example, if you're in kind of a high intensity situation or during more aggressive phases of firefighting, adherence to the PPE may fluctuate, and it's influenced by factors like stress of the situation, by communication challenges, by operational priorities. Ensuring consistent and correct usage of SCBA and other PPE is essential for mitigating the risks of the firefighting exposures. So I'll just remark on that. It wasn't as much integrated into our job exposure matrix, but it's an important point as we go through. To evaluate routine firefighting exposures, several measures have been used in the literature. So there's years of service. That's probably the most commonly used metric and the easiest to use. Total fire responses and days in active duty roles, that's also used. Self-reported exposure assessments, like Dr. Calvert mentioned in the introduction, also offer insights into perceived sort of hazards. And then there was a study from a couple of years ago, which I'll discuss in a moment, that developed the job exposure matrix that's used, which combined fire responses, job titles, and duration of activities to sort of refine exposure assessments and understand risks over the course of a firefighter's career. So in this presentation, I'd be remiss to not sort of recognize the efforts of the NIOSH investigators, Drs. Dom and Dr. Daniels, in developing a retrospective job exposure matrix for the career firefighters at San Francisco, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And what the authors did was they addressed this critical issue in firefighter health research. The use of employment duration as a proxy for exposure, that may bias risk estimates. So their study, which I believe spanned many, many decades ago, from 1950 through about 2010, it used departmental records to sort of standardize job titles, fire apparatus assignments, and integrate data on fire runs and hours. By analyzing these surrogate metrics, like exposure duration and times at fire, the study improved exposure estimates and reduced misclassification rates, or at least provided evidence to show where the misclassifications might occur. So their research was really a crucial inspiration for this project, emphasizing the need for refined exposure metrics to enhance risk assessment in firefighting. Just a little bit on the study. It identified these strong associations, these strong relationships among various exposure metrics, including employment duration, actual exposure time, number of fire responses, and time spent at fires, with particularly strong associations observed between fire responses and time spent at fires. So comparing misclassification rates between employment duration and actual exposure time, it revealed these discrepancies to the tune of 16 to 30%. And this underscores the significant inaccuracies when relying solely on employment duration. The recommendation was to incorporate job titles and specific assignments alongside employment duration. So now, transitioning to our current research, building on the foundation laid by the NIOSH investigators, we aim to sort of estimate particle exposures by integrating these job descriptions and fire run data, incident data, and as well as publicly available land use information to estimate particle concentration at a fire scene. So using their work is a really crucial first step in building upon that. So I'll delve into this shortly. Today, my focus will be on like outlining the development process of our job exposure matrix for smoke particle mass. And then following this, I'll present in a study that was more of a proof of concept study that explores the relationship between firefighting exposures and lung function, which is obviously crucial for doing the daily tasks of in the field. So first we'll cover the JEM development process. So this was a study that we published in early 2023 in Occupational Environmental Med. And our aims were to create a job exposure matrix for fire-related hazards by utilizing administratively collected data. So data that were collected irrespectively of any research question, but more for administrative purposes, on firefighting activities and incident details from both structural and non-structural fires. Our goal was to estimate particle concentration specifically from these types of fires using this JEM. So in the cohort, we had 3,200 participants who were actively employed as of January 1, 2010. You may ask why we didn't maybe start the follow-up period earlier. This is when data were available electronically to us and in a clean format. So we started at January 1, 2010. So this obviously eliminates some of the firefighters who retired before that point, or retired at the time of 9/11, or retired before 9/11 and responded to the disaster. So by September 2021, all of these participants were no longer employed, they were retired. And each participant was a member of the World Trade Center Health Program. And it's important to note that these data pertain to responses attended by this study cohort, not the underlying FDNY active population between 2010 and 2021. So just really keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. So these findings aren't generalizable necessarily to the current cohort, or even the cohort that was active during the duration of 2001 through 2024, for example. In terms of methodology, the JEM incorporated 3 key data points, which are collected administratively. It first considers the type of fire incident, which includes details about the building type and the surface involved. It then evaluates the severity of the incident, and we used alarm level as a proxy for severity of an incident. Finally, it looks at a firefighter's engagement by examining their position titles that was used to upweight or downweight the amount of exposure they got at a fire incident. Fire incident types were categorized into two types: structural fires, which are constitute a large number of the buildings in New York City, and they're classified into 16 distinct categories; and non-structural fires, which are categorized in 12 different types. Fire incident severity was estimated by alarm levels, which range from first alarm to fifth alarm. For those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with first, second, third, fourth, fifth alarm, this is what fire departments use to indicate the severity of an incident and the scale of the response required. So in other words, the higher the alarm level, the more fire trucks that are going to an incident, for example. Firefighter engagement was classified into two categories based on position titles, right? So we had highly exposed and minimally exposed. Highly exposed positions involved sort of the direct firefighting tasks, while minimally exposed positions are assigned a lower exposure due to their distance from a smoke plume. So there's a lot on this slide, but adjusted smoke particle mass quantities or concentrations from structural and non-structural fires were calculated based on firefighter engagement. And we used methodology which we borrowed actually from the EPA. So we used this AP or Air Pollutants 42 framework to estimate emissions. This analysis also incorporated publicly available data from the New York City Planning Database for building types and sizes, and considered fire incident severity as indicated by those alarm levels that I mentioned before. And we also estimated structural damage, and that's loss rate, right? The amount that was burned in a fire, the amount that was lost. Firefighter engagement was categorized into, again, highly and minimally exposed roles. Highly exposed positions were directly involved in first line firefighting tasks. For example, knockdown and overhaul. These were assigned a multiplier of 1, so they're getting the most exposure. In contrast, minimally exposed positions, they were assigned a factor of 0.11, and this is based on mass conservation equations, which considered smoke plume characteristics and other environmental factors. The diagram here kind of provides a high-level overview of the JEM creation process. We categorized incident types into 28 distinctive categories, so 16 structural and 12 non-structural, and combined this with publicly available data on building use and size, as I noted before. We then use the 5 severity categories to estimate property loss from fires and assign them an emission factor. So this resulted in 140 categories altogether of particle emissions, and that was further refined based on whether participants were highly or minimally exposed. So the first part is the type of fire they're attending, the type of building, and the second part kind of refines it even further based on whether they were in a minimally or highly exposed position. So here's an overview of the fire incident categories. I won't cover every category in detail, but to highlight a few, you have structural fires that can include such fires like multiple dwelling fires or commercial buildings, while non-structural fires include examples like automobile fires, which are a common non-structural fire incident that firefighters tend to. A lot, obviously, on this slide as well, but these firefighting positions encompass a range of roles and responsibilities, from specialized tasks like you have marine firefighting and rescue operations to general firefighting and support functions. So they include roles like backup. What that means is those who are responsible for support during fire suppression. The FAST unit, for example, is focused on rapid intervention and rescue and various other levels. So these are very the firefighters are very specialized, so they have very advanced skills and different responsibilities depending on what type of role. We categorize that into highly exposed and minimally exposed. In terms of computations, particle mass, it was calculated for each of the 280 JEM categories by combining the incident type, the severity, and the exposure conditions. So again, using that EPA, the AP42 framework, we quantified particle emissions in kilograms per fire event, right? So this involved the particle generation factor, EF sub I, data on combustible materials, so denoted here, M sub S, M sub B, the average building surface area, which is important, like how big the building was, S sub I, and the average loss rate per fire is denoted by L. So again, we'd first calculate for a given fire incident, and that was either upweighted or downweighted based on whether a firefighter was in a highly or a minimally exposed position. We also evaluated the feasibility of a two-dimensional job exposure matrix applying only fire severity engagement and a constant emission factor for each of the 5 severity categories. And our thought process here was that most departments have alarm level. They may not have the granularity of the fire incident data. So this method in the box here, we basically pulled the incident type piece out. We really relied on alarm level. And this is cruder, but maybe has more ease and is more transportable to other fire departments. So this method, again, relies on fire alarm level for a given incident. Is a practice that, the fire alarm practice is used across fire departments and especially professional fire departments around the country. And this is the reduced model that I won't go through the equations again, but this is the reduced model, which more heavily relies on just alarm level. On to the results of the study. So the average age of the cohort, 46 years old. At the beginning of the 2010 period. And they were followed for about 6 years over the follow-up period. That's considerably shorter than some of our other studies. Again, we're constrained by only having data through 2010 through 2021. Also, a lot of these firefighters had already been employed for a considerable amount of time. They're an older cohort. These aren't like new, fresher firefighters who were newly hired by FDNY. Most of the cohort was white. And regarding responses, the majority were unexpectedly first alarm fires and kind of non-fire medical emergencies, while the more severe 3rd, 4th, and 5th alarm fires were relatively rare, fortunately. And that's a good thing. Given the urban setting of New York City, it's not surprising also that the incidents were predominantly structural. Okay, so here we examine sort of monthly trends of fire incidents by alarm level and particle emissions from 2010 through 2021. So we have the black lines, right, that represent fire incidents of lower acuity, 1st and 2nd alarm fires. And then the red lines, right, they indicate the higher severity incidents, 3rd to 5th alarm. Generally, 1st and 2nd alarm levels correlate well with emissions, although there are periods, right, around 2016 that significantly impact exposure levels. So it's important to note that exposures do not increase proportionally over time or decrease proportionally. There's also like kind of some seasonal variability kind of baked in here. And that's an example of when basically you have the higher intensity fires correlating with the particle, the blue line going up. So the red line going up and corresponding with the blue line, suggesting that there's more particles released at the higher acuity incidents. And again, I continue to kind of underscore this, but these are representative only of the FDNY retired cohort that was available to us in the study, not the active FDNY cohort. So this is very much a subset, even of the underlying World Trade Center cohort. It's an underlying subset. And that's the reason I don't want folks to take away or come home with the takeaway that firefighting exposures were decreased over time in that 2016 to 2020 period. This is more a function of more people kind of dropping out of the cohort. Okay, so we also took a look at spatial patterns of smoke exposure. So we analyzed spatial distributions of 71 New York City community districts. On the left-hand side, we present estimated exposures using the JEM metric, while on the right, we show the number of fire incidents attended. Our findings reveal that these two measures don't always track together. They don't always correlate, right? So for instance, if you look very closely at the southern part of Manhattan, like over here, they're at the 80th percentile for personal exposure. So they likely had like more the high acuity fires during this period, but it ranks 20th percentile with the number of fire incidents attended. So that just shows the discrepancy between personnel attending the higher acuity incidents, which may not reflect the overall exposure. And it's crucial to understand here, the take home I want you to get, that fire incidents alone are not an ideal metric for measuring actual exposure. That's why it's necessary to refine it. So just a little bit on the notation here, on the particular in the Y columns, you have P total. So this is total particle concentration using the fire incident, the full complement of inputs at our disposal, while P total alarm is calculated only using alarm levels. It's the cruder one, right? But we conducted correlational analysis using these scatter diagrams, and we calculated our squared values to depict the relationships between years of firefighting service and the various metrics. So in A, B, and C, you'll see that employment years on the horizontal axis compared to number of fire responses in A, particle exposure estimation using alarm only in B, and particle exposure using alarm and incident type on Y, respectively. So our findings here, albeit crude, they're consistent with what our colleagues at NIOSH found. So we confirmed that the previously noted limitations of using these kind of cruder metrics. We also found that alarm level remains maybe a useful metric for distinguishing between the high and low exposure levels. That's depicted in D. Despite using these detailed land use information, alarm effectively discriminates between the exposure levels and can be valuable even when you don't have the granular incident type data, you don't have this high quality GIS data at your disposal. Observations indicate, so these are kind of the conclusions or preliminary findings that we found in the study. Observations indicate a decline in fire incidents and exposures over time due to likely cohort attrition. You had your high density periods of fire incidents revealing varying levels of particle emissions depending on the severity of the fires and the fuel loads involved. In terms of our strengths, the JEM methodology has been refined, again, to quantitatively assess smoke particle emissions from both structural and non-structural fires by expanding on the previous frameworks to include continuous measures of particle concentration. So this sort of enhancement, coupled with the utilization of high-quality incident and response and building data that were publicly available, it improves the accuracy of particle quantity concentration and is applicable potentially to other cohorts that do have these data. There are several limitations that we're aware of and we're working through for future work, for future research. So the tool currently lacks validation, with efforts to validate it being sort of deferred to future studies, and we'd like to, sample a subset of the active cohort that have like personal air monitors when they're attending fires as part of our validation. There are concerns about cohort representativeness that I've kind of mentioned several times throughout the presentation. The study does not include incidents involving the active duty FDNY workforce outside of the study period, and it honestly skews toward firefighters in senior crew positions because you're getting the FDNY World Trade Center base at a much later time point. So these, we only had data for this 11-year period. People were sort of retiring during that period. So that's another limitation. Additionally, there are uncertainties in the emission factors. This was a necessary first step. We did our best using prior methodology and prior publicly available data to estimate emission factors and fuel load estimates. But some of these data may be outdated. That's something we could certainly update in the future. But this may lead to possible overestimation of smoke aerosols released, particularly in low intensity fire incidents. In terms of other limitations, there are challenges in accurately estimating building characteristics and home insurance records, right? That arise from relying on only median surface from a building. So we don't have building specific data. We only have those categories of building where we took the median. Incomplete data on time spent at fires affects exposure measurements and may lead to misclassification. That's also a concern. The particle emission estimates have limited external validity for sure compared to direct monitoring methods. that we optimally want to use, right? And additionally, there's variability in the use of self-contained breathing apparatuses. We're fully aware of that. That's a larger issue. That's a little harder to tackle, capturing adherence at every fire instance. And the SCBA component is particularly worrisome at the higher alarm incidents, the higher severity ones. In terms of future directions, we hope to enhance our approach. We should expand the focus to include newly hired firefighters, further refining the JEM and calculating structure-specific emissions. We'd like to continue with the validation of the JEM. That should be involved in really a diverse sample of responses, incorporating personal monitoring methods, exhaled breath condensate measures, and sampling debris even at a fire scene. Additionally, it's crucial to study the JEM in relation to other health outcomes, including pulmonary function, and that kind of segues me into the next piece. I'd like to transition to discussing routine firefighting exposure and its impact on pulmonary function, as this naturally follows from our study of particle exposures and health outcomes among firefighters. Pulmonary function is a crucial piece to doing your job as a firefighter. Okay, so just a little bit of background on pulmonary function testing. It's a crucial diagnostic tool for objectively measuring health, right? So it enables longitudinal evaluation to detect and to treat lung injuries. So it helps identify when suboptimal pulmonary function trajectories and intervening early, and it serves as a primary outcome measure in many of our studies. And for this study and many of our other studies, the most reliable metric or outcome measure for pulmonary function is forced expiratory volume in the first second, or FEV1. Okay, so this is probably graphs that many of you have seen, but I'll just, I think it's necessary context for setting us up for analyzing lung function in relation to our job exposure matrix. So there was a lot of early research by Aldrich and Prezant uncovering compelling findings, really, demonstrating a significant decline in lung function immediately after 9/11. And this is across firefighters and non-firefighters and EMS workers, smokers and non-smokers. While this decline persisted for some, it eventually plateaued with only limited recovery to pre-9/11 levels for most people. Our group remains sort of actively engaged in this area of research. So we have the largest and longest follow-up period of pulmonary function testing for a single cohort, and we also have the benefit of really great retention rates. So people are coming in to get their lungs tested. Sort of looking ahead to implications of lung function testing in our cohort, we recently published 2 studies highlighting its value actually as a biomarker. Our findings revealed that baseline lung function, so lung function measured right after 9/11, was linked to around over 2-fold increase in all-cause mortality for every 1 liter decrease in FEV1. And independently, we also observed the longitudinal impact. We found that every 100 milliliter per year longitudinal decline in lung function from baseline was independently associated, after controlling for confounders, an 11% increase in all-cause mortality. So we did a separate study by Cannon et al., and we found that both the FDNY pre-9/11 measures, so the pre-9/11 cohort using lung function before 9/11, and an unexposed general population cohort from NHANES show an elevated risk of long-term mortality among these participants with lung function within the normal range. So even within the normal range, right? So both of these cohorts, we found higher FEV1 was associated with lower mortality, suggesting that higher FEV1 is a marker of better health. And these findings, again, they underscore the value of even a singular cross-sectional measurement of lung function, singular cross-sectional measurement of FEV1. It predicts long-term mortality over 2 decades long, even when FEV1 values are within the normal range. When we shift to non-World Trade Center firefighter cohorts, we observe really a lot of variation, and that was another impetus for doing the study. So in FEV1 decline estimates, they range from -25 mils per year to -110 mils per year. And this variability is influenced by factors like those that are listed here: length of follow-up, the number of follow-up exams, changes in smoking behaviors. There's also healthy worker effect biases that could bias results a bit. And then there are even procedural differences within a study and between studies. So it's very hard to, standardize this across studies. So just to give you a flavor of that, for example, the FDNY study among non-World Trade Center exposed firefighters showed a 45 milliliter per year decline, while the most recent study on Virginia firefighters estimated about a 92 milliliter per year decline. And I'll transition into the actual follow-up study looking at the job exposure matrix and lung function. But before presenting that, I want to highlight some ongoing research in firefighter health. Particularly, there's been cancer studies and cardiovascular disease, sinusitis, and obstructive airways disease studies, which use survey data. So these conditions are actively being studied using sort of self-reported data. And this comes from the Career Firefighter Health Study, which builds on the previous work by the NIOSH investigators with a 3-city cohort of San Francisco and Philadelphia and Chicago. And I think there are plans also to even expand it to some other urban cities. And then just the last thing regarding lung disease in this Career Firefighter Health Study, Miller and colleagues found that firefighters exposed to the disaster had over a 6-fold greater odds of developing asthma compared to those non-exposed to the disaster. So compared to the non-exposed firefighters, they're still firefighters, but not exposed to the World Trade Center disaster. And they had higher odds of COPD. That was the other notable find. These are very strong effect sizes, and this underscores the importance of, really discriminating and distinguishing between World Trade Center exposure and routine firefighting exposure. Okay, so this was our follow-up study, more of a proof of concept study. We sought to demonstrate value of the novel, this novel job exposure matrix in relation to longitudinal pulmonary function, given the limitations of other exposure proxies. So the study basically had 2 main objectives. First, to use the novel job exposure matrix as an exposure surrogate to evaluate association between routine firefighting and pulmonary function. We also looked to see if there was a difference between those who were early arrivers at the 9/11 site and thus had higher exposure versus those who arrived later. So that was more of like a secondary analysis. In terms of methods, the study included the same source population and inclusion criteria as the aforementioned study. It focused specifically, though, on those who retired after 2009 when the exposure data were available. It involved nearly 3,200 participants who retired between 2010 and 2021 and had responded to at least 1 incident during this period. So routine firefighting particle emissions, these were estimated using the job exposure matrix. We kind of got estimated particulate exposure during 15 distinct periods prior to lung function measurement. And then we use linear mixed effects modeling to assess the relationship between particle exposures as a time varying covariate and longitudinal FEV1 while controlling for important confounders like age and race and height, smoking status, and weight in the models. And this kind of puts a sort of a bow on how all the different data sources were integrated. So this diagram illustrates how different data sources were used to calculate particle exposure. It shows the process of deriving smoke particle exposures from the first study and linking it to our pulmonary function data. So you see we took from the roster database, date and time worked, linked that to date and time of a fire incident, making sure it was within the same period. We took the firehouse ID and linked that to who was actually working at that firehouse in a day. We linked the roster data to our employee database at FDNY, and that was used to calculate the smoke particle exposures. And then finally, we linked all of that to the pulmonary function testing data to ensure that the particle exposure preceded the lung function measurement. And then we also use things like questionnaire data to link to get our smoking data and weight data. very preliminary findings for the study. For our finding, we observed every 1,000 kilograms of particle emissions were associated with a 13 milliliter decrease over the course of the 12 years, 13 milliliters per year decrease over the course of the 12 years, sort of above aging. Within the 3 months of the PFT, 1,000 kilograms of particle exposure was linked to a 27 milliliter per year decrease in FEV1. So that suggests that maybe there's like a transient drop in lung function and a rebound. That's just speculative at this point, but more work on that to come. And then we also observed, interestingly, that stronger associations were observed among the firefighters with heavy exposure to the World Trade Center. So when we did this, we looked at the earlier arrivers separately. So we stratified the analysis to those who arrived sort of earlier on to those who arrived later. And we observed this negative 13 milliliter delta. The study had a number of strengths. We felt the study is the first to use a job exposure matrix, right, to estimate exposures from combustion emissions at fire incidents and also link it to a longitudinal health outcome. Improved exposure estimation. So unlike previous studies that relied solely on years of service and the number of fire responses as proxies for particle exposures, the study used a refined estimate that sort of incorporated incident type and alarm level and position title to provide a more precise assessment. Prospective data collection, both exposure, the index data, and pulmonary function testing data were calculated prospectively for healthcare surveillance and administrative purposes. So that minimizes the impact of recall bias from like self-reported measures, for example. Our temporal association was preserved. So we knew when the lung function test was, we knew when the exposure data were, where we knew when firefighters were theoretically exposed. So that allowed us to maintain the exposure response temporal association. And this is really a strength of a lot of our studies, but we had repeated lung function measurements. Most participants underwent multiple PFT measurements, which improves precision of regression estimates for both short and long-term exposure effects. Some limitations with this one as well, in addition to the aforementioned ones from the first study. So there was a relatively short follow-up period. The follow-up period examined only a small fraction of a participant's career. So typically, if you have a healthy firefighter, they'll work like 20 to 25 years. This is only capturing at most 11 from 2010 through 2011 with an average of around 6. So that was certainly a limitation. You're also grabbing them at a later juncture of their career. We have limited job exposure matrix data available. So the JEM data were only available again from 2010 to 21. We wish we had that earlier period from 2001 through 2010, but the data were captured a little bit differently. So these together, they potentially introduce some selection bias by excluding older or sicker participants. You're only getting the people who made it to 2010. Unexamined exposure periods, effects of firefights. That's sort of what I was just alluding to. We're missing the data from 01 through 2009. We also don't have there may be some unmeasured confounders where, like any study, observational study, we're constrained by the data that are available to us. However, we thought through which variables we should control for when designing the study. And exclusion of medical leave data. This is potentially important. It's something that we're hoping to look at in the future. So the study did not include medical leave data, potentially introducing bias through informative missingness. For example, lower exposure among participants on leave due to illness. And we did some pressure testing of the data in terms of making sure that some of the cohort attended or had X amount of exposure. So you're not just having some people who were on leave for all but one day. So we looked at that, but we didn't formally integrate medical leave data into the analysis. In terms of take-home messages, smoke particle exposures were modestly associated with both short and long-term lung function declines, especially among those with high World Trade Center exposure. But future research should really drill down on this harder. We should investigate these effects in non-World Trade Center firefighters to help sort of differentiate between the impacts of aging and routine firefighting activities. So with that, I'll conclude with that. I just wanted to acknowledge my wonderful colleagues at Montefiore and FDNY, Einstein, and at CUNY Grad School. This was part of my dissertation work, so I had a really great committee over there, and of course the folks at NIOSH for allowing me to present this work. Thank you very much.